There is a moment near the end of the Season 4 finale where Mark Grayson stands across from the most dangerous being in the known universe and says nothing. Thrag has just ripped the head off Thetis with his bare hands, the same Thetis who engineered the Scourge virus and led the coalition of planets for decades. He has watched 37 surviving Viltrumites scatter across the stars like shrapnel from a dying planet, their homeworld destroyed by the combined effort of Nolan, Thetis, and Mark boring through its core at terminal velocity while Space Racer's Infinity Ray destabilized the planet from the inside. And now, this creature, this Grand Regent voiced with cold, aristocratic menace by Lee Pace, extends an offer that is really a threat dressed in diplomatic language. Live among humans, breed quietly, integrate into the population, and if anyone objects, tear the world apart. Mark accepts because the alternative is extinction, and that single decision rewrites the entire trajectory of this series heading into Season 5. What makes this so fascinating is not the deal itself, but the silence that surrounds it. Mark imagines what would happen if he refused. He sees the terrifying consequences play out behind his eyes, the remaining Viltrumites tearing through cities like wet paper, billions dead in a matter of hours, and he knows that his rage, however justified, is not worth the price. Robert Kirkman told The Direct in April 2026 that the writers have tons of ideas, and that future seasons will incorporate original storylines and side quests alongside the existing comic narrative. That means the road ahead is no longer a straight line from page to screen. The comics gave us a map, but the show is building its own highway, and every theory about where Season 5 might go has to account for the possibility that the destination has changed entirely. If you have been enjoying this kind of deep analysis, subscribing to the channel is genuinely the best way to make sure we keep making these long theory breakdowns for you. So tonight, let us walk through every credible theory about what Invincible Season 5 might hold. Some of these are grounded in the source material, which ran for 144 issues across more than a decade of publication. Some of them are extrapolations from the changes the show has already made, and Season 4 made a lot of them. And some of them are the kind of late-night speculation that feels more and more plausible the longer you sit with it. We are going to talk about Thrag and whether his word means anything. We are going to talk about Debbie Grayson and a fate that comic readers have been dreading for years. We are going to talk about Dinosaurus, about the Scourge virus, about Robot's slow transformation from ally to autocrat, about Anissa and the way the show might handle one of the most controversial storylines in comic book history. We are going to talk about Angstrom Levy's inevitable return, about Nolan's new role as Emperor, about Cecil's secret programs, and about the question that hangs over everything. Will Mark and Eve survive what Season 4 did to them? Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Before we begin with the theories themselves, it is worth taking a moment to appreciate where the show stands right now. Season 4 aired its 8 episodes between March and April of 2026, and by every measurable standard, it was the best season the show has produced. Episode 5, titled Give Us a Moment, became the second highest rated episode in the series' history on IMDb, largely because of the gut-wrenching fight between Mark and Conquest. Episode 7 gave us the destruction of Viltrum itself, 3 Viltrumites flying through the core of a planet at speeds that should have killed them all. And Episode 8, Don't Leave Me Hanging Here, delivered a finale that was simultaneously quieter and more devastating than anything that came before it. The voice cast continues to be one of the best ensembles in animation. Steven Yeun brings a vulnerability to Mark that makes you forget he is voicing a character who can punch through mountains. Sandra Oh makes Debbie Grayson feel like the most important person in a room full of people who can fly. J.K. Simmons delivers a Nolan who is both terrifying and heartbreaking. A man trying to earn forgiveness he does not deserve from people he cannot protect. Lee Pace, new to the cast as Thrag, instantly established himself as the show's most formidable antagonist, playing the Grand Regent with the kind of controlled menace that makes you hold your breath every time he speaks. And the announcement that Matthew Rhys will voice Dinosaurus in Season 5, alongside Sterling K. Brown's returning Angstrom Levy, suggests that the vocal performances are only going to get better. Season 5 is confirmed, with voice recording already completed before Season 4 even premiered. That early production schedule suggests a release window somewhere in early 2027, which means fans will have roughly 10 months to dissect every frame of Season 4 and build theories about what comes next. And if the fan community's track record is any indication, those 10 months are going to produce some extraordinary speculation. So let us add our own to the pile. Let us start with the question the finale left hanging in the air like smoke. Will Thrag actually honor the deal he made with Mark, or is the truce just a longer fuse on the same bomb? To understand what Thrag might do next, you have to understand what he is. Thrag is not just a powerful Viltrumite. He is the Grand Regent, the leader of the most dominant warrior civilization in the known galaxy. He was selected for this role not because of his lineage or his ambition, but because he was the strongest. Pure meritocratic brutality. In a culture that values power above all else, Thrag sits at the very top, and he has maintained that position for centuries through a combination of physical dominance and cold strategic intelligence. Lee Pace brought something unexpected to the character in Season 4. In the comics, Thrag is imposing but somewhat one-dimensional in his early appearances. A wall of muscle and certainty. Pace's performance added layers of restraint that made the character infinitely more unsettling. When Thrag speaks, he does not raise his voice. He does not make threats. He simply describes what will happen if his terms are not met. And the calm precision of those descriptions makes them more terrifying than any screaming villain monologue. The scene where he kills Tatus is not accompanied by a dramatic speech. He just does it, like a man swatting an insect, and then turns back to the conversation as if nothing happened. That is the person Mark made a deal with, and the thought of what that person might do when the deal no longer serves his purposes is enough to keep anyone awake at night. In the comics, the answer unfolds across several arcs. Thrag retreats to a distant part of the galaxy, eventually settling on the planet Thraxa, where he begins breeding a massive army of hybrid Viltrumite children with the Thraxan population. He uses the local species because Thraxans have short lifespans, meaning the children mature quickly. His patience is measured in decades. He does not attack immediately because he does not need to. He is building an empire in silence, growing an army in the shadows, and by the time anyone realizes what he has done, the numbers are overwhelming. When Thrag finally moves against Mark and Nolan, he does so with hundreds of Viltrumite hybrids at his command, each one powerful enough to level a city. The show has already changed the geography of this arrangement in a fundamental way. Instead of Thrag disappearing to another world, the Season 4 finale plants 37 Viltrumites directly on Earth. They are living among humans. They are hiding in plain sight, and the terms of the deal make it clear that any attempt to root them out will result in planetary destruction. This is a fundamentally different setup from the comics, and it opens up narrative possibilities that Kirkman never explored on the page. Think about what that means for the daily reality of this world. Cecil Stedman now has to run a global defense agency knowing that nearly 40 beings with the power to level cities are scattered across the planet and he cannot touch them. Every intelligence operation, every satellite surveillance grid, every contingency plan he has ever built is now pointed at an enemy he is contractually forbidden from engaging. That is not just a military problem, that is a psychological one. Cecil is a man who has spent his entire career controlling threats through information and leverage. He manipulated Mark into becoming a weapon. He weaponized corpses. He made deals with the devil more times than anyone can count. And now, for the first time, he is in a situation where all of his tools are useless. One theory gaining traction is that Cecil will quietly begin developing countermeasures despite the truce. He already has DA, Sinclair working on reanimen built from the corpses of alternate universe Marks, the failed Invincibles who died during the Invincible War back in Season 3. These are not ordinary soldiers. They carry Viltrumite DNA. They have the physical template of the most powerful hero on Earth. And if Sinclair can refine the process, if he can make those dead Marks move and fight with even a fraction of their former power, they represent the closest thing humanity has to a deterrent against a Viltrumite uprising. The question is whether Cecil would be reckless enough to deploy them. In the comics, his pragmatism often crosses ethical lines that make him more dangerous than the villains he is supposed to be fighting. He is the man who put a teenager on the front lines of an alien war. He is the man who turned a sociopathic college student into a military contractor building zombie soldiers. The idea that he would secretly build an army capable of fighting Viltrumites while publicly maintaining the truce is not just plausible. Cecil does not trust anyone, and he certainly does not trust Thrag. The truce, in Cecil's mind, is not a peace agreement. It is a countdown, and he intends to be ready when it hits 0. But here is where the theory gets interesting. If Cecil develops these weapons in secret, and Thrag discovers the violation, the truce collapses. And if the truce collapses, the blood of billions is on Cecil's hands, not Thrag's. That puts Mark in an impossible position. Does he side with the man who has protected Earth through morally questionable means? The man who gave him his first job and has been manipulating him ever since? Or does he honor a deal made with a monster to prevent a genocide that Cecil's paranoia might have triggered? Season 5 could easily position Cecil as a secondary antagonist, someone whose good intentions create a catastrophe that makes Thrag's deal look merciful by comparison. And that would be entirely consistent with the show's central thesis, which is that the most dangerous people in the Invincible universe are not the ones with the most power. They are the ones who are absolutely certain they are right. There is also the question of what the Viltrumites themselves are doing while living on Earth. Thrag told Mark they would integrate quietly, but these are members of a warrior race that has spent millennia conquering planets. Their entire cultural identity is built on domination. They have no concept of equality, no tradition of coexistence, no framework for being part of a society they do not control. Asking them to live as ordinary humans is like asking a wolf to be satisfied with table scraps. Some of them will adapt. Some will discover that human life has pleasures they never anticipated, that there is something to be said for anonymity and simplicity after centuries of endless war. But some of them will not. And the ones who do not, the ones who chafe under the indignity of pretending to be less than they are, will become the first cracks in a truce that was never built to last. Season 4 already hinted at this with the way it portrayed the surviving Viltrumites during the war. Not all of them followed Thrag out of loyalty. Some followed him out of fear, some followed him because the alternative was death at the hands of the Coalition. These are not true believers. They are survivors, and survivors do what they need to do to stay alive. Now that the war is over and the terms have been set, those fractures will only widen. A Viltrumite who was forced to accept the deal might decide that hiding among humans is beneath their dignity. A rogue Viltrumite attacking a city would shatter the truce and force Mark to act. But against whom? The individual who broke the peace, or the system that made the peace necessary. Imagine the scene. A small town somewhere in the American Midwest. A Viltrumite who has been living as a construction worker for 6 months finally snaps. Maybe someone disrespects him. Maybe the sheer boredom of ordinary life becomes unbearable. He lifts a truck over his head and throws it through a building. By the time Mark arrives, 3 people are dead and the truce is in question. Does Mark fight the rogue Viltrumite and risk Thrag interpreting it as an act of aggression? Does he try to talk the Viltrumite down, knowing that every second of hesitation means more human casualties? Does he call Thrag and ask him to discipline his own people, knowing that doing so would mean acknowledging Thrag's authority over Earth? This is the kind of moral complexity that makes Invincible different from every other superhero story. There are no clean answers. There are only choices, and every choice has a cost. And that cost extends beyond the immediate crisis. Every day that passes under the terms of the truce, the demographic reality shifts. The Viltrumites are breeding. That is the entire point of the deal. Thrag did not choose Earth because he likes the weather. He chose it because humans are genetically compatible with Viltrumites, and 7 billion potential partners represent the largest breeding pool in the known galaxy. Every month, every year, the number of Viltrumite hybrids grows, and those children will be born with powers that their human parents cannot comprehend, and their Viltrumite parents view as a birthright. What happens when the first generation of hybrid children starts manifesting abilities? When a toddler in a suburb somewhere throws a tantrum and puts a hole through the kitchen wall? When a teenager discovers they can fly and decides they do not want to hide it? The truce was negotiated between adults who understood the stakes. The children born under its terms have no such understanding. They're a new variable in an equation that was already unsolvable, and their existence changes the calculus of power on Earth in ways that neither Mark nor Thrag can fully predict. Some fans have theorized that Season 5 will show us the first Viltrumite hybrid children born on Earth under the terms of the truce, and that their existence will become the flashpoint for every tension that has been building since the finale. Cecil will want to monitor them, Thrag will want to train them, Mark will want to protect them, and the children themselves, caught between 2 species and 2 worlds, will not know what they are or what they are supposed to become. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is Mark's story repeated on a generational scale, and the show has always been at its best when it forces its characters to confront the patterns they are doomed to repeat. Now, let us turn to a character whose fate in Season 5 has comic readers genuinely anxious. Debbie Grayson, voiced by Sandra Oh, has been one of the most underrated characters in the entire series. She is not a superhero. She does not have powers. She cannot fly or punch through walls or survive in the vacuum of space. She is a real estate agent and a mother, and the show has treated her humanity as both her greatest strength and her most obvious vulnerability. Sandra Oh has delivered some of the best performances in the entire show, and that is saying something considering the caliber of the voice cast. Her confrontation with Nolan in Season 1, the moment she realizes that the man she has loved for 20 years murdered 7 people and lied about it every single day, is one of the most powerful scenes in animated television history. And the show has continued to build on that foundation across every season, giving Debbie layers of resilience, anger, grief, and determination that make her feel more real than characters who can bench press planets. In the comics, Debbie's arc takes a devastating turn during the time jump that follows the Viltrumite War. After Nolan leaves to serve as the new Emperor of the Viltrumites, and Mark becomes increasingly consumed by his responsibilities, Debbie spirals into alcoholism. The loneliness of her situation is crushing. Her husband is ruling an alien empire. Her son is saving the world. Her friends cannot understand what she has been through. She is surrounded by extraordinary people and extraordinary events, but she is fundamentally ordinary, and the gap between what she has experienced and what she can process becomes too wide to bridge. She dies alone, and Mark does not find out until much later. It is one of the most quietly tragic moments in the entire 144-issue run, precisely because it happens off-screen. She does not die in a battle. She does not sacrifice herself to save the world. She just fades the way real people sometimes do. And the weight of that absence haunts Mark for years afterward. The show has already laid the groundwork for this arc, but it has also changed the emotional landscape in ways that might alter the outcome. In Season 4, Debbie confronts Nolan about the murders he committed in Season 1, and instead of reconciling, she rejects him completely. Nolan struggles to open the door, showing his doubts, and Debbie opens it and stares at him, highlighting her courage. Their argument is longer and more emotionally complex than anything the comics gave us. Sandra Oh's performance turns Debbie into someone who is not just wounded, but actively choosing her own dignity over the comfort of forgiveness. That is a fundamentally different character than the one who quietly drank herself to death in the source material. One theory is that the show will use Debbie's death but recontextualize it completely. Instead of dying from alcoholism during a time jump, she might be killed as a direct consequence of the Viltrumite truce. Imagine a scenario where a rogue Viltrumite, one who refuses to live in hiding, attacks a suburban neighborhood. Debbie is not a target. She does not even know what is happening until the wall of her living room explodes inward. She is collateral damage, the most ordinary kind of casualty in a war between gods. And Mark arrives too late because he was on the other side of the world, dealing with a crisis he thought was more important. That version of the story preserves the emotional devastation of the comics while tying Debbie's death directly into the central conflict of the season. It makes Thrag's deal the mechanism of her destruction. It gives Mark a specific person to blame, a specific failure to carry, and a specific reason to question whether accepting the truce was the right decision. And it avoids the criticism that some readers had with the comics, which is that Debbie's death felt like an afterthought in a story that was too busy with cosmic battles to grieve properly. Another theory, and this one is gaining support among fans who have studied the show's pattern of subverting comic expectations, is that Debbie does not die at all. The show has already changed several major deaths, compressing some, delaying others, and outright reversing a few. If Kirkman wants to demonstrate that the show is its own entity, keeping Debbie alive would be one of the most powerful ways to do it. Not because her survival would be fan service, but because a living Debbie creates narrative possibilities that a dead one cannot. Consider what a surviving Debbie looks like in the context of a world where Viltrumites live among humans. She knows the truth. She was married to one. She raised a half-Viltrumite son. She understands on a deeply personal level what it means to share your life with someone who can destroy everything you love without breaking a sweat. That knowledge makes her either the most valuable perspective in the room or the most dangerous, depending on who is asking. A Debbie who survives but has to live in a world where she knows aliens walk among her neighbors. A Debbie who rebuilds her life not despite the trauma, but through it. A Debbie who becomes an unlikely bridge between the human world and the Viltrumite one. Perhaps through her real estate work. Perhaps by becoming an advocate or a quiet intelligence source for Cecil. Perhaps through a relationship that nobody sees coming. The show has invested too much in Sandra Oh's performance to waste it on a death that nearly repeats the comics. There is a third possibility that sits somewhere between these two extremes. Debbie gets seriously hurt. Not killed, but damaged in a way that changes her permanently. She loses her home, she loses her sense of safety, she is hospitalized for weeks. And she has to reckon with the fact that her son, the most powerful person she knows, could not protect her from the consequences of his own decisions. That version of the story preserves the emotional weight, without requiring a funeral, and it gives Season 6 and beyond a Debbie who is harder, sharper, and more willing to take risks because she has already lost everything except her life. Whatever happens, Debbie Grayson is the emotional barometer of Invincible. When she is okay, the audience feels safe. When she is not, the entire show tilts off its axis. Season 5 will almost certainly test that dynamic in a way that makes the previous seasons look gentle. Speaking of characters who are about to have a very bad time, we need to talk about Mark and Eve. because the season 4 finale did not just end with Thrag's deal. It also ended with Eve's confession, and if you were paying attention, that confession might have more long-term consequences for the show than anything Thrag said. During the finale, Eve reveals to Mark that she was pregnant before he left for the Viltrumite War and that she chose to have an abortion while he was gone. She was alone. Her powers were unstable. She had no way to contact Mark across the galaxy. And she made a decision that she had every right to make under circumstances that no one should have to face. This is a significant departure from the comics, where Eve's pregnancy is carried to term and their daughter Terra becomes an important character in the later arcs, a symbol of hope and continuity in a story that often feels like it is about nothing but loss. The show chose to go in a completely different direction, and the implications for Season 5 are enormous. First, consider the obvious emotional fallout. Mark was gone for what felt like months from his perspective, fighting a war across the galaxy, watching friends die, killing Conquest in one of the most brutal one-on-one fights the show has ever depicted. He strangled Conquest to death while the Viltrumite used his final breaths to rip Mark's intestines out through his stomach. Mark survived, barely, and came home carrying the kind of trauma that does not announce itself. It just sits in the quiet moments, waiting. And then Eve tells him she was pregnant, she is not anymore, and she went through all of it without him. That guilt is going to eat Mark alive. He already carries the weight of every person who died in the Viltrumite War, every compromise he made with Thrag, every moment he spent punching through alien soldiers instead of being home with the person he loves. Eve's revelation adds a deeply personal dimension to that guilt. It transforms his absence from a strategic necessity into a personal failure, and it gives Season 5 a character dynamic that is more painful than any fight scene the animators could produce. The important thing to understand is that neither of them is wrong. Eve made the right choice for herself under impossible circumstances. Mark was where he needed to be, fighting a war that could have ended his species. The tragedy is not that someone made a mistake. The tragedy is that the universe put two people who love each other in a situation where no outcome was painless. And living with that knowledge, carrying the weight of what happened without anyone to blame for it, is harder than fighting Thrag. One theory is that the show will use this tension to separate Mark and Eve for a significant portion of Season 5. Not a clean breakup, not a dramatic screaming match, but a slow drift. The kind of erosion that happens when two people who love each other cannot figure out how to talk about the thing that is destroying them. Mark throws himself into managing the Viltrumite truce, spending more and more time flying from crisis to crisis because activity feels better than stillness. Eve focuses on her own recovery, on stabilizing her powers, on rebuilding the life that fell apart while Mark was gone. They are in the same city but living in different worlds, and the distance between them becomes its own kind of violence, quiet and persistent and impossible to dodge. This would serve the narrative in several important ways. It isolates Mark emotionally at the exact moment when he needs support the most. It gives Eve space to develop as a character independent of her relationship with Mark, which the show has been gradually doing since Season 2. And it creates a vulnerability that other characters can exploit. In the comics, Mark's emotional isolation is one of the things that makes him susceptible to Dinosaurus' ideology. A Mark who is connected to Eve, who has someone to challenge his thinking and remind him of what matters, is less likely to be seduced by a villain with a plausible argument. But a Mark who is disconnected from Eve, who is carrying guilt and anger and exhaustion with no outlet, is a Mark who might start listening to anyone who claims to have answers. There is also the question of whether the show will eventually bring the pregnancy storyline back. Terra is a significant character in the later comics, and her existence is tied to several major plot developments, including the final confrontation with Thrag and the epilogue that closes the series. The show might be delaying the pregnancy rather than eliminating it, giving Mark and Eve time to heal before revisiting the possibility of parenthood under better circumstances. Or the show might be making a definitive statement that this version of the story goes somewhere entirely new, that Terra may never exist in the animated continuity, and that the consequences of that absence will ripple through every season that follows. If Terra never exists, the ending of Invincible changes completely. The comics close with a flash forward showing Mark and Eve's family across centuries, a long view of their life together that is both triumphant and bittersweet. Without Terra, that ending is impossible, and whatever replaces it will say something about what the show believes the point of the story actually is. Is it about legacy? Is it about survival? Is it about the choices that define us, even when those choices cost us the future we imagined? Either way, the Mark and Eve relationship is going to be the emotional spine of Season 5, not because they are fighting, but because they are trying not to. And that quiet struggle, the one that plays out in half-finished sentences and avoided eye contact in the empty space where a conversation should be, is often more compelling than any cosmic battle. There is another dimension to this relationship that deserves consideration, and it has to do with Eve's powers specifically. Atom Eve has one of the most extraordinary abilities in the Invincible universe. She can manipulate matter at the subatomic level, rearranging atoms to create or destroy virtually anything. In the comics, her powers have a safety mechanism that activates when she is near death, essentially reconstituting her body at its peak form and unlocking the full, terrifying scope of her abilities. The show has been building toward this revelation for multiple seasons, showing Eve's powers fluctuating and destabilizing in ways that hint at something much larger beneath the surface. If Season 5 pushes Eve to her breaking point, whether through the emotional fallout of her relationship with Mark, a physical threat from the Viltrumites, or the cumulative trauma of everything she has endured, the activation of her full power set would be one of the most visually spectacular and narratively significant moments in the show's history. A fully powered Eve is not just a superhero. She is a force of nature capable of reshaping reality itself. And the question of what she does with that power, whether she uses it to heal or to destroy, whether she stays with Mark or decides she has outgrown the need for anyone else's protection, would define the trajectory of her character for the rest of the series. Some fans have also pointed out that Eve's ability to manipulate matter could be the key to solving the Scourge virus problem. If the virus is a biological agent that attacks Viltrumite DNA, and Eve can rearrange atoms at the subatomic level, she might be the only person capable of creating a cure. That would position Eve not as a supporting character in Mark's story, but as the single most important person on Earth, the one individual with the power to prevent a pandemic that could wipe out both humans and Viltrumites. And the weight of that responsibility, added to everything else she is carrying, would test her in ways that combat never could. Now, let us talk about the character who is about to enter the show and change everything: Dinosaurus. If you only know Invincible from the animated series, you might hear that name and think it sounds ridiculous. A villain called Dinosaurus. It sounds like something from a Saturday morning cartoon, like he should be fighting the Power Rangers instead of the most emotionally complex superhero on television. But in the comics, Dinosaurus is one of the most fascinating and terrifying antagonists Mark ever faces, precisely because he is not wrong about the problem. He is just catastrophically wrong about the solution. David Anders, the man who becomes Dinosaurus, is a genius who can transform into a massive, intelligent dinosauroid creature. When he transforms, his intelligence amplifies along with his physical power. He is not a mindless beast. He is a philosopher with claws, a strategist who happens to be able to bite through steel. His power set is secondary to his ideology. Dinosaurus believes that human civilization is on a path toward self-destruction through climate change, resource depletion, and political inertia. He has looked at the data, run the models, and arrived at a conclusion that is as logical as it is horrifying. The only way to save the majority of the human race is to sacrifice a significant minority of it, to force a course correction through calculated destruction that eliminates the structures preventing meaningful change. In the comics, he does this by destroying Las Vegas, turning the entire city into glass through some kind of extreme thermal event. But that is just the opening move. His real plan involves detonating bombs across Greenland, triggering massive flooding that destroys every major coastal city on the planet. Millions die. The global economy collapses, and in the aftermath, Dinosaurus argues the survivors will be forced to rebuild in a way that is sustainable because they will have no other choice. The old systems that were driving humanity toward extinction will be gone, washed away along with the cities that housed them. Matthew Rhys has been cast to voice Dinosaurus in Season 5. And that casting choice tells you everything you need to know about how the show plans to handle the character. Rhys is an actor known for portraying intelligent, morally ambiguous characters with absolute conviction. He spent 6 seasons playing a Soviet spy in The Americans who genuinely believed he was making the world better through deception and violence. That same energy applied to Dinosaurus would give the show a villain who is not just threatening but persuasive, someone you might find yourself agreeing with for uncomfortable stretches of time before the full horror of his plans becomes clear. The theory that has the most support among comic readers is that Season 5 will adapt the early stages of the Dinosaurus arc while weaving it into the Viltrumite Truce storyline. In the comics, Mark and Dinosaurus have a complicated relationship that develops across multiple arcs. Mark initially fights him, recognizing the immediate danger of a creature who destroys cities to make ideological points. But over time, something shifts. Mark starts to listen. He begins to see that Dinosaurus is addressing real problems that the superhero community has been ignoring. Problems that cannot be solved by punching them. Climate change does not have a face you can hit. Resource depletion does not send an army you can defeat. These are systemic failures, and systems do not care about superheroes. Eventually, in the comics, Mark moves into Dinosaurus' base. They work together on plans to save the world. Mark becomes an accomplice, or at least a witness, to Dinosaurus' vision, and then Dinosaurus betrays that trust in the most devastating way possible, executing his plan without Mark's consent and leaving Mark to deal with the aftermath of a catastrophe he could have prevented if he had been paying attention instead of listening to a monster's persuasive arguments. The show could accelerate this arc by using the Viltrumite truce as the catalyst. Mark is already in a vulnerable emotional state. He has just made a deal with a monster to save the world, and he is watching that deal slowly poison everything around him. His relationship with Eve is strained, his mother is in danger, Cecil is building secret weapons behind his back. The world is supposed to be at peace, but the peace feels like a lie, a thin skin stretched over something that is rotting underneath. Along comes Dinosaurus, a different kind of monster, one who claims to have a plan that will actually fix things. Not a truce, not a compromise, a solution. And Mark, exhausted and isolated and desperate for someone who sees the world as clearly as he does, starts listening. Not because he agrees with the destruction, but because he agrees with the diagnosis. And the distance between agreeing with someone's assessment of the problem and agreeing with their proposed solution is shorter than anyone wants to admit. That dynamic is infinitely more interesting in the context of Season 5 than it was in the comics. In the comics, Mark's alliance with Dinosaurus felt somewhat disconnected from the Viltrumite storyline. They were separate arcs running in parallel, occasionally intersecting but never fully merging. In the show, with Viltrumites living secretly on Earth, Dinosaurus' argument gains a terrifying new dimension. He is not just talking about climate change anymore. He is talking about a planet that is hosting an alien occupation without the consent of its population. He is talking about the slow surrender of human sovereignty to beings who view humanity as breeding stock. And his solution, however violent, is at least an acknowledgement that the current situation is untenable, that the truce Mark accepted is not a peace, but a prolonged humiliation. The destruction of Las Vegas, if the show adapts it, would be a turning point for the entire series, not just because of the scale of the disaster, but because of what it represents. It is the moment when the audience realizes that the villains in Invincible are not just obstacles to be defeated. They are arguments to be reckoned with, and sometimes the arguments are stronger than the fists. There is also the question of how Dinosaurus interacts with the other storylines. If Eve and Mark are drifting apart, Dinosaurus fills the role of a surrogate intellectual partner, someone who gives Mark purpose and direction when his personal life is falling apart. If Cecil is secretly building weapons against the Viltrumites, Dinosaurus becomes either a rival or an unwitting ally, someone whose destructive plans might accidentally expose Cecil's secret programs. And if Robot is beginning his slow transformation toward authoritarianism, Dinosaurus serves as a dark mirror, a character who has already arrived at the conclusion that the world needs to be controlled by someone smart enough to make the hard choices, and who is willing to do whatever it takes to prove it. Every major villain in Invincible represents a different philosophy of power. Omni-Man represented loyalty to empire over family. Conquest represented strength as an end in itself. Thrag represents authority maintained through intimidation. And Dinosaurus represents the most seductive philosophy of all, the idea that intelligence and violence properly applied can save the world. It is wrong, but it takes the entire season to prove it, and by the time the proof arrives, a city is gone and the hero who should have stopped it is covered in someone else's ashes. There is one more aspect of Dinosaurus that deserves attention, and it is the way his character functions as a commentary on the superhero genre itself. Most superhero stories operate on the assumption that the world's problems can be solved by the right person with the right powers. Dinosaurus agrees with that assumption. He is the right person with the right intelligence, and he has calculated the optimal solution. The only thing standing between the world and salvation is the willingness to pay the price. And the fact that the price is measured in lives, in cities, in the screams of people who did not ask to be sacrificed for the greater good, does not change the math. The math is the math, and the math says millions must die so that billions can survive. What makes this so effective as a narrative is that every other character in Invincible operates on some version of the same logic. Cecil sacrifices individuals for the greater good. Nolan sacrificed his family for his empire. Thrag sacrifices his people's freedom for their survival. Even Mark, the hero, sacrificed his integrity when he accepted Thrag's deal, trading the freedom of 7 billion humans for their continued existence. Everyone in this world is making the same calculation Dinosaurus makes. The only difference is scale. Dinosaurus just does the math more honestly than anyone else. That honesty, that refusal to dress up the calculation in noble language, is what makes Dinosaurus the most uncomfortable villain the show has introduced. He does not pretend to be a hero. He does not claim to enjoy the destruction. He simply argues that if the math says a city must burn, you light the match or you condemn everything you were trying to save. And when Mark stands in front of him, exhausted and angry and desperate for someone to blame, Dinosaurus looks at him and says something that Mark will never forget. The only difference between us is that I am willing to admit what this costs. That line, or something like it, adapted for the show, would be one of the defining moments of Season 5, because it forces the audience to confront the same uncomfortable truth. Every hero in every story is making choices about who lives and who dies. The ones we call heroes are the ones who make those choices and feel bad about them afterward. Dinosaurus is the one who makes the choice and moves on. And the show is going to make you wonder, quietly, in the back of your mind, whether the guilt actually makes any difference to the people who are already dead. The Scourge virus is one of those storylines that has been simmering in the background of Invincible for multiple seasons, and Season 5 is almost certainly where it boils over. To understand why, you need to understand what the Scourge virus actually is, where it came from, and why it matters so much to the balance of power on Earth. The virus was engineered by Tatus, the Viltrumite defector who led the coalition of planets until Thrag ripped his head off during the Viltrumite War. Tatus did not just betray the Empire by leaving it, he attempted to destroy it from within. Using his own DNA as a template, he designed a virus specifically to target and kill Viltrumites by exploiting the genetic vulnerabilities that their aggressive breeding program had created. Over generations, the Viltrumites had bred for physical power above all else, and that focus on a narrow set of genetic traits left them susceptible to a pathogen that could exploit those very traits. The Scourge virus swept through the Viltrumite population like wildfire, reducing their numbers from thousands to fewer than 50. It is the reason the war was winnable at all. Without the virus, the coalition would have been fighting a Viltrumite population large enough to overwhelm every planet in the known galaxy. But here is the problem. The virus did not just weaken the Viltrumite, it also has the potential to interact with human biology in unpredictable ways. Because Viltrumite DNA is compatible with human DNA. That compatibility is the entire basis of the breeding program Thrag proposed. Viltrumites and humans can produce viable offspring. Mark himself is proof of that. But that genetic overlap also means that a pathogen designed to target Viltrumite biology might not stop at Viltrumite biology. A mutated strain of the Scourge virus could potentially infect humans, and if it did, the death toll would make the Viltrumite War look like a minor skirmish. In the comics, Mark is infected with a new strain of the Scourge virus, and instead of killing him, it temporarily strips him of his powers. For a Viltrumite hybrid like Mark, losing his abilities is not just inconvenient, it is existential. He is the primary deterrent preventing the Viltrumite truce from collapsing. He is the person Thrag made the deal with. If Mark loses his powers, the deal loses its enforcement mechanism. Thrag has no reason to honor a truce negotiated by someone who can no longer back it up with force. The theory that most fans seem to agree on is that Season 5 will use the Scourge virus as a mechanism to strip Mark of his powers at the worst possible moment. Imagine the scenario. Thrag's truce is holding but barely. Cecil is secretly building reanimin countermeasures. Dinosaurus is escalating his plans. Eve is dealing with her own recovery. And then Mark gets sick. Not dramatically, not in the middle of a battle, but quietly. A cough that will not go away. A bruise that takes too long to heal. A morning where he tries to fly and nothing happens. The gradual realization that the thing that makes him invincible is being eaten away from the inside by a virus designed to kill the other half of what he is. A powerless Mark Grayson is a completely different character. He cannot punch his way through problems. He cannot fly to the other side of the world in seconds. He cannot survive a fall from a building or a bullet to the chest. He is just a 20-something college dropout with a pile of trauma and a world that is falling apart around him. And that version of Mark is forced to rely on the people he has been keeping at arm's length. He needs Eve's powers. He needs Cecil's resources. He needs his mother's wisdom. He might even need the Viltrumites who are supposed to be his enemies. Because without his powers, any one of them could end his life with a casual backhand. The vulnerability of a powerless Mark creates storytelling opportunities that a superpowered Mark simply cannot. When Mark can solve problems with force, the conflicts are physical. When he cannot, the conflicts become personal, political, psychological. He has to negotiate instead of fight. He has to trust instead of verify. He has to ask for help from people he does not fully trust and accept the conditions that come with that help. And every one of those conditions carries a price that will come due later. The Scourge virus also creates a fascinating paradox when combined with the Viltrumite truce. If the virus can be weaponized against the Viltrumites living on Earth, it represents exactly the kind of countermeasure that Cecil would kill to possess. but deploying it would mean infecting Mark too, since he carries Viltrumite DNA. And the new strain hinted at in the comics has the potential to cross over into the human population, creating a pandemic that could kill billions. So the weapon that could end the Viltrumite threat is also the weapon that could end humanity. That is the kind of impossible choice that Invincible specializes in. The kind where every option is the wrong one and the only real question is which wrong answer kills the fewest people. There is also the question of who deploys the virus. In the comics, the circumstances are messy and accidental, a chain of events that spirals out of control. But the show could choose to make it deliberate. Imagine Cecil deciding that the Viltrumite threat is too great to leave unchecked and authorizing the release of the Scourge virus as a targeted bioweapon, only to discover that targeted bioweapons do not stay targeted. Imagine the horror on Mark's face when he realizes that the man who is supposed to protect Earth just poisoned it. Imagine Thrag's response when he discovers that humans have developed a weapon specifically designed to exterminate his people, a weapon that violates every term of the truce he offered in good faith. That scenario transforms Cecil from a morally gray ally into a war criminal. It gives Thrag a legitimate grievance against humanity. It forces Mark to choose between defending the man who tried to save the world and acknowledging that the man's methods might be worse than the threat he was trying to stop. And it would give Season 5 the kind of devastating moral collapse that has made Invincible the most thought-provoking superhero show on television. There is a deeper question embedded in the Scourge virus storyline that the show has the potential to explore in ways the comics never fully did. What does it mean to be a species that engineers its own potential destruction? The Viltrumites created their vulnerability through centuries of selective breeding. They optimized for strength and durability at the expense of genetic diversity, and that narrowing of the gene pool is what made the Scourge virus possible. In a real sense, the Viltrumites built the weapon that nearly destroyed them. The virus was just the finger on the trigger. That parallel to human concerns about monoculture, about the dangers of optimizing for a single variable while ignoring the fragility it creates, gives the Scourge virus storyline a resonance that goes beyond alien viruses and superhero drama. The show has always been good at finding the human truth inside the cosmic spectacle, and the Scourge virus is an opportunity to talk about what happens when a species becomes so focused on what it can do that it forgets to consider what it cannot survive. For Mark specifically, the virus represents the ultimate identity crisis. His Viltrumite half is the source of his power. His human half is the source of his empathy. The Scourge virus attacks the former while leaving the latter intact, stripping away the superhero and exposing the person underneath. And the question of whether that person, Mark Grayson without the invincibility, is strong enough to hold the world together is the question that Season 5 needs to answer. Not with a fight, not with a dramatic rescue, but with the quiet courage of someone who keeps showing up even when showing up is all they can do. Let us shift gears and talk about Robot because his arc is one of the most important slow burn storylines in the entire Invincible universe. And Season 5 is where it starts to accelerate in ways that the audience might not see coming until it is too late. Rudolph Connors, the genius who operates under the name Robot, has been a supporting character since the very first season. He started as a seemingly benevolent ally, a brilliant mind in a mechanical body who helped the Guardians of the Globe protect Earth. He was awkward and earnest and seemed genuinely committed to doing good. Then, the show revealed the truth, layer by layer. Rudy is a severely deformed human being living in a life support tank, controlling drone bodies remotely. He cloned a new body from Rexplode's DNA because he wanted to be normal, to be able to touch someone, to be able to look at Monster Girl without seeing pity in her eye. He fell in love, and the love was real, but the methods he used to pursue it were a preview of everything he would eventually become. In the comics, Robot's arc culminates in one of the most shocking and philosophically rich developments in the entire series. After being trapped in the time-dilated Flaxen dimension alongside Monster Girl, where they spent what felt like hundreds of years while only months passed on Earth, Rudy returns fundamentally changed. The Flaxen dimension aged him, it hardened him, it taught him that compassion is a luxury that leaders cannot afford. He conquered the Flaxens not through negotiation, but through force, building an empire from the ground up using his intelligence as a weapon. He created a society that was stable, peaceful, and utterly authoritarian. And it worked. The Flaxen dimension, which had been a chaotic mess of warring factions for centuries, became orderly under his rule. When he comes back to Earth, he looks at the chaos and dysfunction of the superhero world with the eyes of a man who has solved this problem before. He sees heroes who are powerful but disorganized. He sees a government that is corrupt and incompetent. He sees villains who keep escaping, and civilians who keep dying, and a system that treats all of it as normal, as the acceptable cost of a free society. And he decides that what worked in the Flaxen dimension can work here too. He stages a coup, he kills Cecil, he takes control of the Global Defense Agency, and through it, the entire global defense infrastructure. He deploys an army of drones that monitor every communication, track every movement, and neutralize any threat before it can escalate. And the result is genuinely terrifying, not because it is dystopian, but because it is effective. Crime drops to zero, conflict ends, natural disasters are managed with perfect efficiency. The world is at peace, but the cost of that peace is total submission to a dictator who has decided, with the calm certainty of a man who has done this before, that freedom is less important than survival. The show has been seeding this transformation since season 2, and the signals have been getting stronger with each passing season. Rudy's willingness to cross ethical lines that other characters will not, his cold pragmatism when discussing casualties, his growing frustration with the inefficiency of democracy and the stupidity of diplomatic compromise. Every time the Guardians fail to prevent a disaster, every time a human institution proves inadequate to the threats the world faces, Rudy files it away. He is building a case piece by piece for the argument that will eventually justify everything he does. And the Viltrumite truce is going to be the biggest piece of evidence yet. Think about it from Rudy's perspective. Mark Grayson, the strongest hero on Earth, just made a deal with an alien warlord that allows nearly 40 superpowered beings to live on Earth without any oversight whatsoever. No monitoring, no accountability, no mechanism for enforcement if the terms are violated, no plan for what happens when, not if, the truce breaks down. For a man who spent centuries building a perfect society through absolute control, this is not just unsatisfying. It is an abomination. It is everything Rudy has learned to reject. The theory that fans are most excited about is that Season 5 will show the early stages of Robot's radicalization, while keeping him sympathetic enough that the audience does not see the full picture until it is too late. Not the coup itself, that is likely a Season 6 or Season 7 event, but the philosophical groundwork. Rudy starts making decisions without consulting the team. Small things at first. Deploying a drone without authorization, accessing Cecil's classified files, building systems that give him more information and more control than anyone else in the room. He forms alliances with people who share his worldview. He starts to view Mark not as a friend, but as an obstacle, a well-meaning but dangerously naive hero who keeps making deals with people who deserve to be eliminated rather than negotiated with. The genius of Robot's arc is that he is right about almost everything except the conclusion. The world is chaotic, human institutions are failing, the Viltrumite truce is a ticking bomb, Cecil's methods are unethical, Mark's idealism has costs measured in body counts. Every criticism Robot levels at the existing order is valid. The only thing that is wrong is his solution, which is to replace all of it with himself. And the gap between valid criticism and authoritarian action is exactly where the most dangerous people in history have always lived. Monster Girl's role in this transition is equally important. In the comics, her relationship with Rudy deteriorates during their time in the Flaxen Dimension. She watches him become harder, colder, more willing to use violence as a first resort rather than a last one. She sees the person she loved disappear into the leader he is becoming, and she has to decide whether to follow him into that darkness or resist it. When they return to Earth, she is both his closest ally and his most dangerous liability. The one person who knows what he is truly capable of because she watched it happen in real time over the course of centuries. Season 5 will likely begin planting the seeds for Robot's eventual turn, while keeping the audience guessing about how far he will go. And when the coup finally comes, in a later season, it will feel not like a surprise but like an inevitability, the logical conclusion of every quiet decision Rudy made when no one was paying attention. What makes Robot's arc so effective as a slow burn storyline is that the audience will be complicit in it. Every time Rudy makes a pragmatic decision that solves a problem, every time his cold logic proves more effective than Mark's emotional approach, the audience will find themselves nodding along. He is efficient, he is rational, he gets results. And the seduction of competence, the appeal of someone who actually seems to know what they are doing in a world where everyone else is improvising, is powerful enough to make you forget that competence without empathy is just a more sophisticated form of violence. The show has an opportunity with Robot that very few superhero stories have explored. Most stories draw a clear line between heroes and villains, even when they try to complicate it. Robot's arc erases that line entirely. He will do terrible things for genuinely good reasons. He will save lives by taking others. He will create peace by destroying freedom. And the audience will have to decide not whether he is right or wrong, because the answer is both, but whether the world he builds is a world worth living in. That question, whether safety without freedom is worth the trade, is one of the oldest questions in political philosophy. And the fact that Invincible is willing to spend multiple seasons building toward it, investing the time and character development necessary to make the question feel genuinely difficult, is what separates it from every other show in its genre. Anissa. Even saying the name provokes a reaction in fans who know the comics, because Anissa's storyline is one of the most controversial and difficult arcs in the entire Invincible run. And the way Season 5 handles her will tell us a lot about the show's willingness to engage with deeply uncomfortable material, while finding a path that serves the story without causing unnecessary harm. In the comics, Anissa is a female Viltrumite who is sent to Earth as part of the integration program. She is a loyalist who believes in the Viltrumite mission of spreading their DNA across as many compatible species as possible. Her assignment is straightforward: breed with humans to produce Viltrumite offspring and strengthen the species. When she encounters Mark, she becomes obsessed with him, viewing him as the ideal genetic partner due to his proven Viltrumite heritage. This obsession escalates to a point where Anissa assaults Mark, an act that the comics depict explicitly, and that is widely regarded as one of the most disturbing moments in the series. The show has signaled, through multiple interviews and creative decisions, that it will not adapt this storyline in its original form. Kirkman has spoken about the responsibility of handling sensitive material in a medium that reaches millions of viewers, and the show has already demonstrated a willingness to change storylines that might not translate appropriately to animation. The Eve pregnancy change is a recent example. The comics handled it one way. The show found a different path that served the characters and the themes, while being more thoughtful about the implications. So the question is not whether Anissa will appear in Season 5. She almost certainly will, as she is a key Viltrumite character who plays a significant role in the integration storyline and the broader politics of the post-war world. The question is what the show does with her instead. One theory that has gained significant traction is that the show reimagines Anissa as a philosophical antagonist rather than a physical one. In this version, she arrives on Earth as one of the Viltrumites covered by Thrag's truce and immediately begins integrating into human society with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm. She gets a job, she makes friends, she learns about human culture with what seems like authentic curiosity, and then she starts having conversations with Mark. Instead of targeting Mark through violence, she challenges him ideologically. She is a Viltrumite who genuinely believes that the integration of Viltrumites and humans is a good thing, not just for the Viltrumites but for humanity. She looks at the history of human warfare, human cruelty, human environmental destruction, and argues that the addition of Viltrumite genetics could produce a hybrid species that is not only stronger but more capable of surviving the challenges that pure humans have been failing to address for millennia. She sees the hybrid children that will result from the breeding program as the next step in evolution, a stronger, more resilient species that combines the best of both worlds. And she makes this argument with enough intelligence and conviction to make Mark uncomfortable, because the truth he cannot admit is that she might have a point. Mark is a Viltrumite human hybrid. He is, by any objective measure, a superior being. He can fly. He is nearly invulnerable. He will live for thousands of years. If every human had those capabilities, the problems that keep Mark up at night, the wars, the disasters, the slow grind of entropy and decay, would largely disappear. Anissa is not wrong about the potential. She is wrong about the method, about the consent, about the right of one species to decide the evolutionary destiny of another. But separating the valid insight from the horrifying implementation is harder than it should be, and that difficulty is what makes her dangerous. Another theory takes a more politically oriented approach. Anissa arrives on Earth as one of Thrag's Viltrumites, but she quickly begins positioning herself as an alternative leader. She does not challenge Thrag openly, because she is not suicidal, but she starts building alliances among the other Viltrumites, particularly those who are uncomfortable with Thrag's leadership, but lack the power to oppose him directly. She becomes a faction leader, a Viltrumite who represents a different vision of what the integration could look like, one that is based on genuine coexistence rather than Thrag's cold tactical calculation. In this version, Anissa is not a villain. She is a political operator, someone who uses the truce as cover for her own ambitions, while genuinely believing that her version of integration is better than Thrag's. She might even approach Mark as a potential ally, arguing that they share a common interest in making the truce work without it turning into an occupation. And Mark, desperate for any sign that the Viltrumites might actually be capable of peaceful coexistence, might be tempted to trust her. The show could also use Anissa to explore the theme of cultural assimilation from the Viltrumite perspective. a perspective that has been almost entirely absent from the series so far. What does it feel like to be a member of a conquering species, forced to live as a minority on a planet your people would have once considered beneath them? The indignity of it, the confusion of it, the slow erosion of identity that comes from living in disguise, pretending to be something you are not, suppressing instincts that have been reinforced by millennia of cultural conditioning. Anissa, as someone who has to navigate that experience in real time, could become one of the most sympathetic and complicated characters in the entire show, someone the audience genuinely cares about even when they disagree with everything she represents. Whatever the show does with Anissa, it needs to be smarter and more thoughtful than what the comics did. And given the track record of the creative team, there is good reason to believe it will be. There is a broader point here about the Viltrumite integration that extends beyond any individual character. 37 Viltrumites living on Earth is not just a military situation, it is a cultural one. These are people, or beings, who are close enough to people that the distinction becomes philosophical rather than practical, and they have to figure out how to exist in a world that was not built for them. The strongest among them could bench press a skyscraper, but they have to pretend to struggle with a heavy grocery bag. The fastest could circle the globe in minutes, but they have to sit in traffic. The most ancient among them have been alive for centuries, watching civilizations rise and fall, and now they are expected to care about mortgage payments in school districts and which restaurant has the best lunch specials. That juxtaposition, the cosmic reduced to the mundane, is rich territory for a show that has always excelled at finding the human inside the superhuman. A Viltrumite going to a job interview. A Viltrumite trying to understand why humans voluntarily watch sad movies. A Viltrumite discovering that they enjoy gardening, or cooking, or playing with a neighbor's dog, and not knowing what to do with the feeling because their culture has no framework for pleasure that is not derived from dominance. Those small moments, scattered throughout the season, would make the Viltrumite presence feel real in a way that battle scenes alone cannot achieve. And they would also make the eventual collapse of the truce, whenever it comes, immeasurably more painful. Because by then, the audience will know these Viltrumites as individuals, not just as threats. They will have seen the one who loves painting, the one who volunteers at a food bank because the concept of hunger fascinates them, the one who fell in love with a human and does not know how to tell Thrag. When the truce breaks and the fighting starts, every Viltrumite casualty will carry weight, and every human casualty will carry the knowledge that the person who caused it might have been someone's neighbor last week. That is the kind of storytelling that Invincible is capable of at its best. Not just spectacle, though the spectacle is extraordinary, but empathy, the willingness to make you care about the monster before showing you why the monster is still a monster. And Season 5, if it invests in the Viltrumite integration with the same care it has invested in Mark and Eve's relationship, could produce some of the most emotionally complex television of the year. Let us talk about a theory that does not get enough attention, but could be one of the most emotionally charged developments in Season 5. The return of Angstrom Levy. Sterling K. Brown voices Angstrom Levy with a wounded intensity that makes the character feel less like a supervillain and more like a man who has been broken by the multiverse and is using anger to hold the pieces together. In Season 2, Angstrom attempted to merge the knowledge of his alternate selves into a single consciousness, a process that would have given him the combined experience and intelligence of every version of himself across infinite realities. The process was interrupted when Mark intervened and caused a catastrophic explosion. The result was a physically deformed, mentally fragmented version of Angstrom who blamed Mark for everything he had lost, for the face he can no longer recognize in the mirror, for the memories that belong to other people, for the constant noise of 1,000 lifetimes playing simultaneously inside his skull. Angstrom has the ability to travel between dimensions at will, which makes him one of the most unpredictable threats in the Invincible universe. He can appear anywhere, at any time, from any reality. He does not need to plan an attack months in advance. He does not need an army or a weapon or a base of operations. He just needs a grudge and a destination, and he has both in abundance. The theory that keeps coming up in fan discussions is that Angstrom returns in Season 5 at the worst possible moment, not during a quiet period, not when Mark is prepared, but during one of the season's major crises. Mark is dealing with the fallout of the Viltrumite truce, or fighting Dinosaurus, or recovering from the Scourge virus, and suddenly Angstrom tears open a portal and drags him into another dimension. No warning, no build-up, just a jagged rip in reality, and Mark is gone, pulled out of his world at the exact moment when everyone needs him to be in it. This would serve the show in multiple ways. It removes Mark from Earth at a critical moment, forcing the other characters to deal with the consequences of his absence. Eve has to manage without him. Cecil loses his primary asset. The Viltrumites see an opportunity, Dinosaurus advances his plans unchecked, and the audience, having spent seasons watching Mark carry the weight of the world, suddenly gets to see what the world looks like without him holding it up. It also creates a parallel to Season 4, where Mark's absence during the Viltrumite War left Eve alone to deal with an impossible situation. That parallel would land with devastating emotional impact, because the audience would know what the last absence cost them. Eve lost a pregnancy, Mark lost months of his life. Their relationship nearly broke, and now it is happening again, the same wound reopened, the same abandonment, even though neither of them chose it. In the comics, Angstrom eventually escalates his campaign against Mark by targeting the people Mark loves. He threatens Eve, he threatens Mark's family, he uses the multiverse as a psychological weapon, pulling in alternate versions of reality where things went differently, where Mark failed, where the people he cares about are already dead. He shows Mark a world where Omni-Man succeeded in conquering Earth, a world where Eve was killed, a world where Debbie died, and Mark was not there to save her. Each alternate reality is a knife aimed at Mark's sense of purpose, a demonstration that in a universe of infinite possibilities, the version where everything works out is the exception rather than the rule. That psychological warfare is as devastating as any physical attack, because it forces Mark to confront the fundamental fragility of everything he has built. Every decision he has made, every crisis he has averted, every life he has saved, exists in balance with infinite versions of itself where it all went wrong. And the cumulative effect of seeing all those failures, all those dead worlds, all those versions of himself who could not save anyone, would push Mark to the kind of despair that physical violence never could. If Season 5 uses Angstrom well, he will not need to be the main villain to be the most devastating presence in the story. He is the thread that connects the multiverse to the personal. He takes the largest possible question, what if everything were different, and aims it directly at one person's heart. Now let us address Nolan, because Nolan's new role as Emperor of the Viltrumites is one of the most underexplored aspects of the post-Season 4 landscape, and it has massive implications for everything that happens in Season 5. At the end of the Viltrumite War, with Thrag's authority challenged and the Empire in ruins, Nolan was positioned as the heir to the Viltrumite throne. In the comics, this is based on the revelation that Nolan is actually descended from the original Viltrumite bloodline, making him the legitimate ruler of the species by birthright. The show may or may not follow this exact lineage, but the result is the same. Nolan, the man who slaughtered the original Guardians of the Globe, the man who beat his own son half to death, the man who abandoned his family and then came crawling back, is now the ruler of the most powerful warrior species in the galaxy. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. Nolan spent decades on Earth pretending to be a hero while secretly serving the Viltrumite Empire. He betrayed that mission because he fell in love with a human woman and a human son. And now, after all of that, after the betrayal and the violence and the tentative reconciliation, he is exactly what the Empire always wanted him to be: a leader. The only difference is that this time, he has to lead the people he was supposed to conquer. One theory about Season 5 is that Nolan's role as Emperor will create a direct conflict with Thrag over the loyalty of the surviving Viltrumites. Thrag offered the truce as Grand Regent, but if Nolan is the legitimate Emperor, then Thrag's authority to make that deal is questionable at best. And Viltrumites, for all their brutality, respect hierarchy. If Nolan asserts his claim, some Viltrumites might follow him instead of Thrag, fracturing the already fragile truce into competing factions. That fracture would put Mark in the impossible position of choosing between his father and the stability of the deal that is keeping Earth safe. If Mark supports Nolan's claim, he undermines the truce. If he supports the truce, he undermines his father. And if the factions go to war with each other, Earth becomes the battlefield, with billions of humans caught between Viltrumite armies that are supposed to be living peacefully among them. There is also the personal dimension of Nolan's leadership. In Season 4, Debbie rejected Nolan completely, refusing to forgive the murders he committed in Season 1. That rejection leaves Nolan emotionally adrift. He has a title and an empire, but no family, no home, no anchor to the humanity he spent 20 years developing. An emperor without personal connections is either a philosopher king or a tyrant, and the line between them is thinner than anyone wants to believe. Mark's relationship with Nolan has been the beating heart of Invincible since the first episode, and Season 5 will continue to test it. Can Mark trust a father who has lied to him, beaten him, and betrayed everything he claimed to stand for? Can Nolan prove that his love for his son is stronger than his Viltrumite instincts? And can both of them navigate a political landscape that requires them to be allies when their personal history keeps pulling them apart? There is one more thing about Nolan that deserves attention: Oliver. Mark's half-brother, the Viltrumite Fraxan hybrid who nearly died when Conquest crushed his skull during Season 4. Oliver is young, and he is growing fast. In the comics, Oliver develops a much more hardline attitude toward conflict than Mark. Where Mark tries to find peaceful solutions, Oliver gravitates toward permanent ones. He is more willing to kill. He is more comfortable with violence as a first response rather than a last resort. And his Viltrumite heritage gives him the physical capability to back up those instincts. If the show follows this trajectory, Oliver could become one of the most interesting characters in Season 5. Imagine a young, recovering Oliver who watched his brother strangle Conquest to death, who saw his father help destroy an entire planet, who has spent his formative experiences surrounded by the most violent beings in the universe. That child is not going to grow up believing in diplomacy. He is going to grow up believing in strength, because strength is the only thing that has ever kept him alive. Oliver, as a secondary character who slowly drifts toward Viltrumite values, would create a fascinating parallel with Mark. Mark has spent the entire series fighting against his Viltrumite nature, trying to be human in a body designed for war. Oliver, who is younger and has had fewer human influences, might embrace his Viltrumite side more readily, and watching two brothers diverge, one toward humanity and one toward empire, would give Season 5 an additional layer of family drama that resonates with the show's deepest themes. But the Oliver theory goes deeper than personality differences when you actually look at what the comics did with him. In the source material, Oliver does not just lean toward violence. He actively crosses lines that Mark refuses to cross. And the first time it happens, it changes the dynamic between the brothers permanently. Oliver encounters the Mauler twins, those recurring villains who keep cloning themselves and causing problems, and instead of subduing them the way Mark would, he kills one outright. When the other surrenders, Oliver kills him too. No hesitation, no remorse. And when Mark confronts him about it, Oliver does not apologize. He does not even understand why Mark is upset. He argues that eliminating villains who will inevitably escape and kill again is not murder. It is efficiency. It is the logical extension of what every hero does when they fight someone dangerous. The only difference is that Oliver finishes the job. That argument is chilling precisely because it is not stupid. You can hear the Viltrumite logic in it, the cold arithmetic of a species that conquered galaxies by deciding that the fastest path between 2 points is through anyone standing in the way. And Oliver did not learn this from a textbook or a propaganda broadcast. He learned it from watching his father destroy a planet. He learned it from watching his brother strangle Conquest to death with his bare hands while the man's intestines hung from his stomach. He learned it from nearly dying himself when Conquest crushed his skull, and he had to be rebuilt from the broken pieces of a body that was never designed to take that kind of punishment. Every lesson Oliver has absorbed about how the universe works has been written in violence, and the idea that he should respond to that violence with restraint and mercy would sound, to someone with his experience, like advice from someone who has never actually been in danger. The show has an opportunity to develop this tension gradually across Season 5, showing Oliver's recovery from his injuries running parallel to his ideological drift. As his body heals and his Viltrumite abilities continue to develop, as the Thraxan aging that accelerated his childhood gives way to the slower maturation of his Viltrumite half, Oliver will become physically more capable at the exact rate that his moral compass drifts further from Mark's. You could structure an entire subplot around moments where Oliver handles a situation violently and Mark has to decide whether to confront him or let it slide. And every time Mark lets it slide, every time he tells himself that Oliver is young and will learn, the gap between them widens a little more. In the comics, Oliver eventually takes the name Kid Omni-Man and later Young Omni-Man, and that naming choice is significant. He does not choose to be the next Invincible. He chooses to be the next version of his father, the man who murdered the original Guardians of the Globe and tried to conquer Earth. And while Oliver's version of that legacy is more nuanced than Nolan's original mission, the symbolic weight of the name tells you everything about where his loyalties ultimately fall. He identifies with the Viltrumite side of his heritage. He sees strength as the primary virtue and restraint as a weakness that gets people killed. And when the moment comes, much later in the comics when Oliver has to choose between Mark's ideals and Thrag's power, his decision will surprise everyone, except the people who are paying attention to every small choice he made along the way. There is also the question of how Oliver's radicalization interacts with Nolan's new role as Emperor. If Nolan is trying to reform the Viltrumite Empire to lead it towards something less brutal and more compatible with the universe Mark wants to build, Oliver's drift toward traditional Viltrumite values puts father and son on a collision course that mirrors the original Mark and Nolan conflict from Season 1, but in reverse. This time, it is the child pulling toward Empire and the parent trying to resist the gravity of what his species has always been. Nolan spent 20 years pretending to be human, and the pretense changed him. Oliver spent his entire life surrounded by the consequences of Viltrumite power, and the exposure is changing him in the opposite direction. Two members of the same family, shaped by the same history, arriving at opposite conclusions about what that history means. That is tragedy written at the genetic level. And the most painful part of Oliver's arc, the part that comic readers have been dreading since his introduction in the show, is that his radicalization is not the end of his story. In the comics, Oliver eventually becomes a double agent for Thrag, feeding information to the Grand Regent while maintaining his cover among Mark's allies. Whether he does this willingly or under coercion depends on how you read the scenes, but the result is the same. Oliver betrays his brother, and when he finally turns against Thrag, when he tackles the Grand Regent to save Mark's family at the cost of his own life, the redemption does not erase the betrayal. It just makes the grief more complicated. You mourn the person he became at the end while carrying the weight of everything he did to get there. And Mark, who watched his little brother die doing the right thing after spending years doing the wrong one, has to figure out how to carry that contradiction for the rest of his very long life. Season 5 will not get to the end of Oliver's arc. That is a story that needs multiple seasons to tell properly. But the foundation has to be laid now, in the quiet moments when Oliver says something that makes Mark flinch. In the training sessions where Oliver hits a little harder than necessary. In the conversations where Oliver asks questions about the Viltrumite truce that Mark does not want to answer because the honest answers sound too much like the things Nolan used to say. The radicalization of Oliver Grayson is a slow fire, and Season 5 is where the first sparks catch. We should also talk about Alan the Alien, because his role in the post-war landscape is going to be far more significant than most people expect. Alan has been one of the most consistently entertaining characters in the series, a massive purple alien with a good heart and a terrible sense of timing. But beneath the humor, Alan is a leader. He ran the Coalition of Planets as intelligence operations, he coordinated the war effort against the Viltrumites. And now that the war is over, he faces a challenge that is, in some ways, harder than fighting: holding together an alliance that no longer has a common enemy. The Coalition of Planets was built on fear. Dozens of alien species, each with their own cultures, their own governments, their own histories of grievance and ambition, united by a single shared threat. The Viltrumites wanted to conquer them all, and that mutual danger forced cooperation between civilizations that might otherwise have had nothing in common. Now the Viltrumites are defeated, or at least diminished. The immediate threat is gone, and without it, the Coalition is a building without a foundation. One theory about Season 5 is that the show will develop an Alan-centered subplot about the Coalition's fracturing. Member worlds start pursuing their own agendas. Some want to finish the Viltrumites off entirely, truce or no truce. Some want reparations. Some want to claim former Viltrumite territory for themselves. And Alan, who is brilliant but not a diplomat, has to navigate political waters that are as dangerous as any battlefield. This subplot would serve the larger narrative by expanding the scope of Season 5 beyond Earth. The Viltrumite truce is not just an Earth problem, it is a galactic one. Every species the Viltrumites conquered, every planet they devastated, every civilization they tried to absorb has an opinion about whether 37 surviving Viltrumites should be allowed to live in peace. And some of those opinions are violent. If Alan fails to hold the Coalition together, the consequences could be enormous. A rogue Coalition faction might decide to attack the Viltrumites on Earth, violating the truce from the outside rather than the inside. That would force Mark to defend the very aliens he made the deal with, putting him in the absurd position of fighting former allies to protect former enemies. And the moral complexity of that situation, defending the monsters who threaten to destroy your world because the alternative is a war that destroys it anyway, is exactly the kind of no-win scenario that Invincible does better than any other show. There is also the complicated matter of what Alan himself thinks about the Viltrumites. In the comics, Alan's perspective on the Viltrumite threat becomes increasingly extreme as the story progresses. He begins to view the Viltrumites not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a species to be eliminated, permanently. His reasoning is coldly logical. The Viltrumites have demonstrated across thousands of years of history that they are incapable of coexistence. Every peace they have offered has been temporary. Every alliance they have formed has been strategic. They are, in Alan's assessment, a predator species that mimics cooperation when it is outnumbered and reverts to conquest the moment it regains its strength. If the show follows this trajectory, Alan could become an unexpected antagonist in Season 5. Not because he opposes Mark personally, but because his solution to the Viltrumite problem is one Mark cannot accept. Alan might advocate for using the Scourge virus to finish what it started. to wipe out the remaining Viltrumites before they can rebuild. He might argue that Thrag's truce is exactly the kind of temporary cooperation that has always preceded Viltrumite aggression, and he would have centuries of historical evidence to support his position, evidence that Mark would struggle to refute because, on some level, he fears that Alan might be right. That conflict between Mark and Alan, between a human who made a deal with the devil and an alien who wants to kill the devil while it sleeps, would add a layer of galactic politics to Season 5 that grounds the personal drama in something larger. It is not just about what happens on Earth, it is about what happens to the entire galaxy if the Viltrumite experiment succeeds. If 37 survivors become 300, and then 3,000, and then 30,000. Each generation stronger than the last, each generation further removed from the defeat that forced their ancestors to hide. Alan might also serve as Mark's connection to the larger universe when Mark is at his most isolated on Earth. A phone call, a visit, a moment of friendship between two people who have fought side by side and survived. Those moments of connection matter in a story that is increasingly about disconnection, and Alan's warmth and humor would provide much-needed relief in what is shaping up to be one of the darkest seasons of the series. But here is the thing that makes Alan's trajectory so much more dangerous than most people realize. And it is the detail that the Season 4 post-credits scene dropped into the narrative like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Thetis, before Thrag tore his head off, left Alan a recorded message. A final set of instructions from beyond the grave. And those instructions include the location of a perfected version of the Scourge virus, one that would not just weaken the Viltrumites, but annihilate them entirely. Every last one. Nolan included. Mark included. Oliver included. Thetis told Alan to ignore his personal attachments, to set aside his friendship with Mark and his respect for Nolan, and to release the virus for the good of the universe. That is the weight Alan is carrying into Season 5. Not just the political challenge of holding the coalition together, not just the philosophical disagreement about whether Viltrumites can coexist with other species. He is carrying the literal means to commit genocide, handed to him by a man he trusted, with instructions to use it. And the perfected virus does not just kill Viltrumites, because Viltrumite DNA is compatible with human DNA, because the two species can interbreed. The perfected strain would cross the species barrier. It would kill humans too, billions of them. The weapon that could end the Viltrumite threat forever is also a weapon that would end humanity as collateral damage. Think about what that does to Alan as a character. He is not a monster. He is not a villain in the traditional sense. He is someone who has spent his entire life fighting the Viltrumites, who has lost friends and worlds and years to the war against them, and who genuinely believes that allowing them to survive is an existential risk to every other species in the galaxy. He has the data. He has the history. He has 1,000 years of Viltrumite conquest as evidence that this species, however diminished it might be right now, will rebuild and reconquer if given enough time. And now he has the weapon. The only question is whether he will use it. The show set this up with deliberate precision. The post-credit scene was not an afterthought. It was the most important scene in the entire finale because it established that the greatest threat to Mark in Season 5 might not be Thrag or Dinosaurus or the Scourge virus itself. It might be his best friend, the person he trusts most in the galaxy, the big purple alien who makes him laugh and has saved his life more than once. That person is now sitting on a weapon of mass destruction and listening to the voice of a dead man telling him to use it. If the show plays this correctly, Alan's arc in Season 5 will be a slow-building horror story told from the perspective of someone the audience loves. You will watch Alan struggle with the decision. You will see him rationalize. You will see him look at the data and arrive at conclusions that are logically sound and morally catastrophic. And you will understand, even as you are screaming at the screen for him to stop, why he thinks he is making the right choice. Because the Viltrumites have earned every ounce of Alan's distrust. They have earned the suspicion, they have earned the fear. The only thing they have not earned is the benefit of the doubt, and Alan is not inclined to give it. The tension between Alan and Mark over the Scourge virus could become the emotional backbone of the season's galactic subplot. Mark made a deal to save Earth. Alan sees that deal as a death sentence for the galaxy. A temporary reprieve that gives the Viltrumites exactly what they need to rebuild. And when Mark tells Alan to trust him, to believe that the truce can hold, Alan has to look at his friend and weigh that friendship against the survival of every non-Viltrumite species in existence. Friendship is not a strategy. Trust is not a defense system. And the love Alan feels for Mark does not change the math any more than Mark's love for Eve changed the math when he accepted Thrag's terms. That is the cruelty of the storyline. It takes two people who genuinely care about each other and puts them on opposite sides of an impossible equation. Alan does not want to kill Mark. He does not want to kill Nolan or Oliver or any of the people he has fought beside. But he might decide that the alternative, allowing the Viltrumite species to persist and eventually reconquer the galaxy, is worse than any personal loss. And if he makes that decision, if he releases the perfected virus, the resulting catastrophe would dwarf everything else that happens in Season 5. It would rewrite the entire show, and the man responsible would not be a villain. He would be a friend who decided that the math mattered more than the people in it. There is another threat lurking in the background that most fans have not connected to the Season 5 theories, but it deserves attention. The Sequids. These parasitic alien organisms were introduced in the earlier seasons, and their potential as a long-term threat has been seeded but never fully realized. The Sequids are a hive mind species that takes over host bodies, overriding the consciousness of the host and absorbing them into a collective intelligence. The more hosts they take, the smarter they become. The more bodies they control, the more powerful they get. In a world where Viltrumites are living secretly among humans, the Sequids represent a terrifying wildcard. Imagine a Sequid organism finding its way to Earth, perhaps through one of the many alien connections the planet now has, and beginning to spread through the human population. The paranoia that would generate, the fear of anyone around you being secretly controlled by something alien, would mirror the existing tension of the Viltrumite truce in devastating ways. Humans are already living with the knowledge that aliens walk among them. The Sequids would take that fear and multiply it by the inability to tell friend from enemy, human from host. And here is the nightmare scenario that some fans have theorized. What happens if the Sequids infect a Viltrumite? A normal Sequid host is dangerous but manageable. A Viltrumite host, one of the most powerful beings on Earth, controlled by a parasitic hive mind with no loyalty and no restraint, would be a catastrophe on a scale that makes Dinosaurs' plans look modest. And the truce that Mark negotiated would be meaningless against a threat that neither side anticipated. The Sequids could also force an unlikely alliance between Mark and the Viltrumites. If both species are threatened by the same parasite, they might have to work together to stop it, and that forced cooperation, enemies becoming reluctant partners against a common threat, would echo the original formation of the coalition while adding new layers of distrust and suspicion. Whether or not the show uses the Sequids in Season 5, the concept they represent, an external threat that forces internal alliances, is almost certainly going to be part of the narrative. Because one of the central questions of the post-war world is whether the enemies who agreed to stop fighting can ever become something more than enemies. And sometimes the only way to find out is to give them something worse to fight together. The Sequid threat also raises fascinating questions about what qualifies as a person. If a Sequid takes over a Viltrumite host, is the host still alive in any meaningful sense? Is killing the host to stop the Sequid morally acceptable? What if the host has a family, children, a life that matters to people who are not infected? These are the kinds of philosophical landmines that Invincible loves to plant in the middle of its action sequences. And a Sequid storyline would give the writers room to explore the intersection of body horror and ethical philosophy in ways that would make the best episodes of the show even better. There is also the question of how the GDA would respond to a Sequid outbreak. Cecil has spent his career building systems to contain threats, and the Sequids represent the kind of threat that containment cannot address. You cannot arrest a hive mind. You cannot negotiate with a parasite. You can only burn it out, and the burning usually destroys everything it has touched. If Cecil has to make the choice between letting a Sequid infection spread and ordering the destruction of an entire infected zone, complete with innocent human hosts, he will make the cold calculation he always makes. And the aftermath of that calculation will give Mark another reason to question whether Cecil is protecting humanity or just controlling it. One theory that circulates among the more detail-oriented fans concerns the Guardians of the Globe and their role in Season 5. The Guardians have always been a secondary concern in Invincible, a team that exists primarily to get beaten up in ways that demonstrate how dangerous the real threats are. The original team was slaughtered by Omni-Man in the first episode. The replacement team has been repeatedly outmatched by threats that are supposed to be above their pay grade. And the individuals on the team, Rexplode, Shrinking Ray, Black Samson, Bulletproof, and the others, have had varying amounts of screen time and character development. Season 5 might change that, with Mark potentially sidelined by the Scourge virus or pulled into another dimension by Angstrom Levy. The Guardians would need to step up in ways they never have before. They are the backup plan, they are the line of defense when the primary weapon is unavailable. And if the show is serious about exploring what happens when Invincible is not invincible anymore, the Guardians are the characters who have to carry that weight. Bulletproof is particularly interesting in this context. In the comics, when Mark loses his powers, Bulletproof temporarily takes over the Invincible mantle. He wears the costume, he tries to be the hero that Mark was, and he discovers, painfully, that being invincible is not about the powers or the suit. It is about the willingness to sacrifice everything. And that willingness is not something you can put on and take off like a uniform. A Bulletproof as Invincible storyline in the show would explore what happens when someone tries to fill shoes that were never meant to fit them, and it would give the audience a new perspective on how impossible Mark's life actually is. There is also the question of Rex Splode. In the comics, Rex dies heroically during a major battle, sacrificing himself by detonating his own body to save others. The show has given Rex more depth than the comics did in his early appearances, portraying him as arrogant and selfish, but also capable of genuine growth. If Season 5 follows the comic trajectory, Rex's death would be one of the season's most emotional moments, a redemption arc that pays off seasons of character development. And Robot's response to Rex's death, given that Rudy cloned his body from Rex's DNA and eventually takes Rex's name in his honor, would add another brick to the wall of Rudy's eventual transformation. The Guardians of the Globe in Season 5 are not just a team, they are a mirror. They reflect what happens to ordinary heroes in a world that has moved beyond anything they were designed to handle. And their struggles, their failures, and their occasional moments of genuine heroism would provide a ground-level perspective on the cosmic events happening above their heads. There is also the matter of Black Samson, whose powers in the comics fluctuate in ways that could mirror Mark's Scourge virus arc. Samson lost his powers once and spent years as a non-powered member of the Guardians, fighting alongside teammates who could do things he could only watch. When his powers returned, the experience of powerlessness had changed him. He was more cautious, more empathetic, more aware of how fragile the line between hero and bystander actually is. If the show gives Samson screen time during a season where Mark is also experiencing power loss, the parallel would underscore the theme that heroism is not synonymous with power. Some of the bravest people in the Invincible universe are the ones who keep fighting even when the physics say they should not be able to. And then there is William and Rick, Mark's college friends, the ordinary humans who have been pulled into extraordinary circumstances simply because they are close to someone who can fly. William and Rick represent the civilian perspective on everything that is happening, and Season 5 could use them effectively as a lens through which the audience sees the Viltrumite integration from ground level. What does it feel like to be an ordinary person in a world where aliens live next door? What does it feel like to know that your best friend made a deal with a warlord, and that deal is the only thing keeping you alive? William's humor and Rick's quiet determination have been underutilized in the show so far, and Season 5 represents an opportunity to give them the kind of material that would make the audience care about the non-powered characters as much as they care about the ones in costumes. Before we begin to bring all of these threads together, there is one more theory worth considering. It concerns the show itself, the meta-narrative of what Invincible is becoming as a piece of television. Kirkman created the Invincible comics in 2003, and the series ran for 13 years before concluding in 2018. The animated show began in 2021, and with Season 5 expected in early 2027, it will have been running for 6 years by the time the next batch of episodes arrives. The show has become something the comics never were. A cultural phenomenon. Millions of people who have never read a single issue watch the show, debate the theories, and care about these characters with an intensity that the comic audience, as passionate as it was, simply could not match in terms of scale. That changes the creative calculus. When Kirkman was writing the comics, he was answerable primarily to himself and his relatively small readership. He could take risks, make controversial choices, and trust that his audience would follow him because they had signed up for exactly that kind of story. The show does not have that luxury, or rather, it has a different version of it. The show reaches tens of millions of viewers, many of whom have no context from the comics and no expectation of what is coming. Every choice the show makes, every death it commits to, every relationship it breaks, every moral line it crosses, lands with exponentially more impact than the same choice in the comics. That scale of impact is why Kirkman's comments about deviating from the comics are so significant. He is not just saying that the show will tell different stories. He is saying that the show will tell stories that the comics could not, stories that take advantage of the larger audience, the different medium, and the 6 years of character development that the animation team has built with performances that the static page could never deliver. Sandra Oh's Debbie is not the Debbie from the comics. Stephen Yeun's Mark is not the Mark from the comics. J.K. Simmons' Nolan is not the Nolan from the comics. They are richer, deeper, more human versions of those characters, shaped by actors who have invested years of their careers into making these people feel real. Season 5 is going to take advantage of that investment, and the theories we have discussed tonight, however informed and however plausible, are just our best guesses at what a group of extraordinarily talented people are going to do with characters they know better than anyone. The real surprises will be the ones we never saw coming, the moments that make us sit up in the dark and think, oh, I did not expect that, and then lie back down and realize, of course, that is where this was always going. Now there is a theory that requires us to look much further down the road, past Season 5 and into the endgame of the entire series. And that is the question of how the show will eventually adapt the final battle between Thrag and Mark, arguably the most iconic confrontation in the entire 144-issue run. In the comics, the final fight between these two does not happen on a battlefield or in a city, or on some distant planet. It happens inside the sun. Thrag and Mark, two of the most powerful beings in existence, fighting to the death while being incinerated by nuclear fusion. The imagery is biblical. Two figures burning alive, flesh melting and regenerating and melting again, punching each other through plasma that is millions of degrees, their bodies reduced to charred silhouettes that keep fighting because stopping means dying. And neither of them can accept that outcome. The fight strips away everything, the costumes, the ideologies, the politics, the grudges, until all that remains is two organisms driven by the primal imperative to survive. And Mark wins not through superior strength or a clever strategy, but through an act of desperate animal violence. He bites through Thrag's throat. He tears the Grand Regent's windpipe out with his teeth, while both of them are burning alive inside a star. That is how the villain who has haunted this entire series finally dies. Not with dignity, not with a dramatic speech. He dies choking on his own blood in the heart of a sun, killed by a man who had to become something barely human to survive long enough to land the killing blow. And Mark, who fully expects to die in the same fire, is only saved because Alan flies into the sun and carries him out. The hero lives not because of his own strength, but because someone who loves him refused to let the sun have him. The question for the show is whether it will commit to that level of savagery. Animation has no physical limitations. You can draw anything. You can show the sun's interior in ways that live action could never afford. You can animate flesh melting off bone and reforming in real time. You can make the audience feel the heat, the desperation, the absolute collapse of everything civilized, into pure survival instinct. The technical capability is there. The creative team has already demonstrated through the conquest fight and the destruction of Viltrum that they are not afraid of graphic violence when the story demands it. The question is whether they will push further than they have ever pushed before, into a sequence that would be, without exaggeration, the most viscerally intense fight scene in the history of animated television. And there is a narrative question that sits alongside the technical one. The comic version of this fight works because of everything that precedes it. Thrag has spent years on Thraxa, breeding his hybrid army, building his forces in silence, and when he finally attacks, he does so with hundreds of Viltrumite Thraxan hybrids at his command. The war that leads to the final confrontation is not a skirmish. It is a full-scale conflict that spans multiple planets and costs thousands of lives. By the time Mark and Thrag face each other inside the sun, the audience has been through years of buildup, years of watching this inevitable collision approach with the certainty of a comet. The show has changed the setup. Thrag is not on Thraxa, he is on Earth, or at least his Viltrumites are. If the show follows the comics and eventually sends Thrag to breed an army on another world, it will need to find a way to transition from the Earth-based truce to a galactic conflict that justifies the scale of the final battle. If it keeps Thrag on Earth, the final confrontation might look completely different, might happen in a city or an orbit or in some location that the comics never imagined. Either way, the show has to earn the fight. It has to build toward it across multiple seasons with the patience and precision that the creative team has already demonstrated, so that when Mark and Thrag finally face each other for the last time, the audience feels the weight of every deal, every compromise, every betrayal, every quiet moment of dread that led to this point. One of the most disturbing details in the comic version is that Thrag throws his own children at Mark during the final battle, using them as living projectiles, and they die on impact because Mark is simply too powerful for them to survive the collision. Thrag sacrifices his own offspring as weapons, and the horror of that act tells you everything you need to know about what the Viltrumite Empire ultimately valued. Not family, not loyalty, not even survival in the end. Just dominance, pursued to the absolute extreme, even at the cost of everything a person should hold sacred. The show will have to decide whether to include that detail, and if it does, the audience reaction will be unlike anything the series has generated before. Because there is violence, and then there is the violence of a father using his children as ammunition. That is a line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Whether the show reaches the final Thrag battle in Season 7 or Season 8 or beyond, Season 5 is where the foundation of that confrontation has to be laid. Every scene where Thrag appears calm and controlled is a scene that makes his eventual explosion more terrifying. Every moment where Mark questions whether the truce was the right decision is a moment that feeds the inevitability of the final reckoning. The sunfight is the destination. Season 5 is where the road toward it begins to narrow, where the audience starts to understand that there is no exit ramp, no diplomatic solution, no compromise that will prevent these two from eventually trying to kill each other inside a star. And that leads us to perhaps the most ambitious question of all, the time skip. In the comics, after Thrag is defeated and the immediate crises are resolved, the story does something extraordinary. It jumps forward, not by months or years, but by decades, and then centuries. The final issues of Invincible cover a span of roughly 500 years, showing Mark's life in a series of compressed vignettes that are both triumphant and deeply melancholic. You see his daughter Tara grow up and become her own version of a hero, working with an intergalactic humanitarian relief program, before eventually wearing her own version of the Invincible costume. You see his son Marcus join the Guardians of the Globe as Kid Invincible. You see Mark and Eve grow old together, or rather grow into something beyond old, because Viltrumite lifespans are measured in millennia, and Eve's powers eventually allow her to match that longevity. You see Mark become the Emperor of the Viltrumite Empire, not through conquest, but through the slow accumulation of trust and responsibility. Under his leadership, the Empire transforms from a conquering force into something closer to a galactic peacekeeping organization, bringing stability and prosperity to worlds that had known nothing but war. The coalition of planets becomes obsolete because there is nothing left to coalesce against. Alan and Mark, who spent years on opposite sides of the Viltrumite question, eventually resolve their differences, though not without a conflict that nearly destroys everything they built. The galaxy enters an era of genuine peace, and Mark presides over it for centuries, watching generations rise and fall, while he remains, changed but enduring, the boy who could fly grown into something no one could have predicted. The time skip is what gives the Invincible comics their emotional resonance beyond the superhero genre. It takes the question that every long-running story eventually asks, what was it all for? And answers it with the kind of sweeping generational scope that makes you feel the weight of a life lived across centuries. Mark's story does not end with a battle. It ends with a conversation. An old man, impossibly old, sitting with the people he loves, looking back at a life that contained more pain and more joy and more consequence than any single existence should reasonably hold. And the final page is not a punch or an explosion. It is Mark telling his story to someone who was not there, passing the weight of everything that happened to the next generation so they can carry it forward. The question is whether Amazon will commit to adapting any of this. The time skip requires something that most television studios are allergic to: patience. You cannot rush 500 years of narrative into a single episode. You cannot compress the slow transformation of a warrior species into a montage. You need time, you need seasons, you need the kind of long-term storytelling commitment that television networks routinely promise and rarely deliver. There are reasons for cautious optimism. Amazon has already renewed Invincible through Season 5, with voice recording completed well ahead of the premiere schedule. The show's critical and commercial success gives it leverage that most animated series never have. Kirkman has spoken repeatedly about wanting to tell the complete story, and the creative team's willingness to deviate from the comics suggests that they are not interested in a rushed adaptation that hits the major beats and calls it done. They want to build something. They want the show to earn its ending the way the comics earned theirs, through years of investment in characters and themes and the kind of slow-building narrative architecture that rewards the audience's patience with payoffs that feel genuinely earned. But there are also reasons for concern. Animation is expensive. Long-running animated series for adult audiences are rare, and the ones that exist tend to have shorter seasons and longer gaps between them. If Invincible needs 8 or 10 seasons to tell its complete story, that is a commitment of a decade or more. And the entertainment landscape changes fast enough that a decade of guaranteed support is almost unheard of. Amazon could decide at any point that the cost-benefit calculation no longer works. They could compress the remaining story into fewer seasons than it needs. They could end the show before it reaches the time skip entirely, leaving the most emotionally powerful section of the comics unadapted. The theory that keeps circulating among the most dedicated fans is that the show will adapt the time skip but reimagine it completely. Instead of 500 years of compressed vignettes, the show might use a shorter time jump, perhaps 20 or 50 years, and focus on a single generation of consequences. Mark and Eve's children, if the show eventually gives them children, navigating a world shaped by their parents' choices. The Viltrumite integration entering its second or third generation, with hybrid children who have never known any world but Earth. The political landscape reshaped by Robot's coup and its aftermath, by the Scourge virus and its legacy, by every decision made in every previous season finally bearing fruit. Bitter and sweet in equal measure. That reimagined time skip would give the show a way to deliver the emotional scope of the comics without requiring a literal half-millennium of narrative. It would show the audience what their investment in these characters was worth. And it would answer the question that has been building since the very first episode. Not whether Mark can win, because we have always known he can, but whether winning was enough. Whether the world he saved is a world worth living in. Whether the compromises he made and the people he lost and the parts of himself he sacrificed along the way add up to something that justifies the cost. That question is what separates Invincible from every other superhero story ever told. Most superhero stories end with victory. Invincible ends with the question of what victory actually means when you have to live with it for 500 years. Let us step back and consider the big picture for a moment. Season 5 of Invincible is going to be the season where the show truly becomes its own entity, distinct from the comics in ways that go beyond individual changes and into the fundamental structure of the narrative. The first 4 seasons adapted the comics with varying degrees of fidelity, compressing some arcs, expanding others, and making changes that ranged from subtle to seismic. The Eve abortion, the Conquest fake-out post-credit scene, the Damian Darkblood detour, the extended Debian-Nolan confrontation, but the core narrative beats remained recognizable. If you had read the comics, you could roughly predict where the show was heading, even if the path was different. That changes now. Kirkman has explicitly said that the future of the show will deviate from the comics, and the Season 4 finale set up a status quo that is different from anything in the source material. Viltrumites on Earth instead of scattered across the galaxy. Eve's pregnancy ended instead of carried to term. Thrag's truce as a deal made directly with Mark instead of an arrangement imposed from a distance. Thetis dead, Conquest dead and confirmed dead through a deliberately funny post-credits scene. Nolan positioned as Emperor. Cecil building an army of Invincible-based reanimate. Each of these elements is a departure from the comics, and together they create a foundation for a story that no one, not even the most dedicated comic readers, can fully predict. And that is what makes Season 5 so exciting. Not just the individual theories, though each of them is compelling in its own right, but the aggregate uncertainty. The feeling that this show, which has already proven itself to be one of the smartest and most emotionally honest superhero stories ever told, is about to enter uncharted territory. The map drawn by 144 issues of source material is no longer reliable. The highway is being built as they drive on it, and the only thing we can say with certainty is that wherever it leads, it is going to hurt. Because that is what Invincible does. It takes the things you care about and it tests them until they either hold or they break. And either outcome teaches you something about what those things were actually worth. Think about the thematic through line of every season so far. Season 1 was about trust and its destruction, the moment when Mark looked at his father and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. Season 2 was about identity and the cost of living a double life, the weight of carrying a secret that defines everything you do. Season 3 was about the weight of responsibility when the stakes become global, when the consequences of failure are measured in civilizations rather than city blocks. Season 4 was about war and the compromises it demands, about the things you sacrifice to survive, and the question of whether the person who comes home is the same one who left. Season 5, based on everything we know and everything we can reasonably theorize, is about the aftermath, the hangover, the reckoning, the moment when the war is over but the damage is still spreading, when the hero looks at the world he saved and realizes that saving it might not have been enough, that the saved world is not the same as the one that was threatened, and the person who saved it is not the same either. Mark accepted Thrag's deal because the alternative was worse, but living with that deal, waking up every morning in a world where 37 Viltrumites walk among 7 billion humans, where the peace is held together by a promise from someone who murders with the casualness of breathing, is going to be its own kind of war. Slower and quieter and more personal than anything he has faced before. This is where Invincible has always been at its best. Not in the fight scenes, though those are spectacular. Not in the cosmic battles, though those are genuinely thrilling. But in the moments after the fists stop flying, the conversations in hospital rooms where people try to reassemble a relationship from broken pieces, the silences between two people who love each other but do not know how to say it anymore, the slow realization that the person you thought you were before the war is not the person you have become after it, the understanding that heroism is not defined by the battles you win but by the mornings you get up afterward and choose to keep going. Season 5 is going to be full of those moments. And the theories we have discussed tonight are just the framework, the skeleton of a story that has not been told yet. The real story will be in the details, in the scenes we cannot predict, in the choices the characters make when no one is watching and the cameras are not rolling, in the quiet devastation that follows every battle Invincible survives, and every compromise he makes with the part of himself that knows, on some level, that there are no good options left. So let yourself drift. Let these theories settle into the background of your thoughts like conversations overheard in another room. Think about Thrag's cold smile and what it might mean when the mask finally drops. Think about Debbie opening her front door and not knowing whether the person standing behind it came to visit or came to end her world. Think about Mark reaching for Eve's hand across a silence that neither of them knows how to break. Think about a genius in a mechanical body looking at the chaos of a broken world and deciding, with the terrifying clarity of someone who has done this before, that he can do better than all of them. Think about a dinosaur who believes that destroying a city is the same thing as saving one. Think about a man with a scarred face standing in front of a portal to another universe, deciding which version of Mark Grayson's life to destroy next. And if you want to be here when we find out which of these theories are right and which of them were just dreams we had while the world was sleeping, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss it. These are the questions that make Invincible more than a superhero show. These are the questions that make it a story about what it means to be alive in a world that is constantly threatening to end, about what it means to be strong in a universe that keeps finding new ways to break you, about what it means to love someone when the distance between you is not measured in miles but in all the things you cannot say. And Season 5, however it unfolds, is going to answer some of them. Just not all. Because the best stories never answer all of them. They just give you enough to keep thinking, enough to keep wondering, enough to keep coming back to this place, wherever you are right now, and letting the questions carry you somewhere quieter. Because tomorrow, the theories will still be here. The questions will still be waiting, and the story, the one that started with a boy who could fly and became something so much bigger and so much more painful and so much more beautiful than anyone expected, will still be unfolding. Good night.